Thank you very much. Do I speak here? Okay. Thank you, Reddy, for this most generous introduction. And also, I would like to cordially thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to give a talk here in Tallinn, one of my favorite places in the Baltic Sea, by the Baltic Sea, and reflect together with you on our shared post-socialist condition seen through the feminist perspective, and on what sort of future, I don't know, alliances, collaborations, dialogues can we envision from this and hopefully build. Okay, so let me see how it works here. All right. So this is some post-socialist feminist art that you can look at while I'm talking. Let me start with a very, very short story, and the story I was told by an Indian scholar, a friend of mine, Kalpana Sahni, who wrote a critical book on the Russian and Soviet Orientalism, debunking the notorious myth of proletarian internationalism in 1997. Kalpana's story of the 2010s is quite a different thing. It demonstrates the shifts that have taken place in the last 25 years, placing many of the post-socialist people, and mostly women, in a strange, delocalized colonial situation, colonized not by one particular country anymore, but by the global coloniality of neoliberal capitalism, which forces the post-socialist subjects to migrate to the global north and become contemporary equivalents of the colonial subalterns. Paradoxically today, the masters are not necessarily white privileged Europeans, but quite often those who were previously the classical subalterns themselves. The race indicator, so powerful before, the symbolic belonging to Europe, goes to pieces, leaving us with a strange picture of the poorly communicating remnants of the two grand modernity projects, the Western European liberal, neoliberal one, and the socialist failed modernity, replaced today with nation-state projects which often go under the pressures of globalization and the necessity to survive between the stronger and the more aggressive powers. So it's a very simple story. Kalpana was in London helping her daughter-in-law with her newly born baby. The daughter-in-law is ethnically Indian, but born and brought up in the US, where her parents, Indians of humble backgrounds, went 40 years ago to improve their prospects. They did. The father became an engineer, the mother a doctor. Now both are retired and wealthy Indian Americans who rented a flat in London and hired a Lithuanian lady cleaner who ran from house to house, trying to make enough to send back home to her son, who is starting to become a doctor. This Lithuanian lady was a marathon runner in her country, where in the years of the Soviet occupation, she had, of course, a standard socialist flat, the meager free amenities provided by the socialist system, and such. Today, her son works in 3 places also to make ends meet. Kalpana, who spent many years in the USSR, was curious to watch the conversations between the Indian doctor, who didn't really know how to treat this servant, in inverted commas, and the Lithuanian woman. One made it from bottom up, the other's life came crashing down. On her last day in London, the Lithuanian woman said something that she had to get home soon because his son was arriving for a few days before he performed in Berlin. Seeing Kalpana's surprised look, she explained that he was a member of the Lithuanian State Philharmonic Orchestra. So now Kalpana was not trying to defend socialism when she was telling the story, because she herself was very critical of it. Rather, she was trying to reflect on the ironies of history that has placed the post-socialist other in a much more difficult and unwinning condition than the post-colonial other, who has been gradually entering the ex-metropolis and winning his or her place there. In the post-socialist case, the trajectory was often the reverse, unfortunately. So the 3 options that you see here that are presented in the title of my talk are by no means the only possible ones in the trajectory of post-socialist feminisms, but they certainly exemplify the most widely spread options, which all evolve around progressivism or reactions against it, around nation building, of course, leaving the post-socialist women in unfavorable conditions of gaining political independence together with their newly independent states, and at the same time losing some of the fundamental rights and freedoms due to neoliberal globalization, to this more and more peripheral situation of the post-socialist Eastern Europe, and the subsequent enforced migrations, displacements, and the loss of social status by large groups of post-socialist people, and especially women. This going back model rhymes with nostalgia, which can take different forms in the post-socialist case. From going back to patriarchal traditions, using women as symbol of nationhood, but only in appropriate and restricted roles, to going back to some pre-socialist, pre-colonial forms of feminist thought and action, and finally to nostalgic forms of reviving the idealized socialist gender discourses. Such nostalgia is often grounded in the effect of distance. The longer time passes after the Soviet occupation, the less urgent becomes this particular historical experience in the long series of various humiliations and losses, promises and deceptions, which may lead once again to a simplification of this past until it becomes a monosemantic illustration, and particularly the past in its humiliating and destructive overtones. For contemporary people, the hardship of surviving in the semi-periphery of neoliberalism and often in neocolonial relations with the West are much more important than the museumized Soviet legacy, which may well be taken to a childhood nostalgia in several cases, in certain cases. Starting from scratch is a radical and even more progressivist erasing of previous experience and knowledge, and forcefully imposing the only allowed Western mainstream feminist assumptions and ideas onto the former Second World, which is then rendered as catching up, forever catching up with the West and always remaining marginal to it. The third option, which I tentatively call here post-East re-existence, indicates a willingness to discard the progressivist mode, or at least question it. The post-East in this case stands not as much for the time period after socialism as for the space, the people who carry in our blood the experience of being branded for several decades as the East and still inhabiting this symbolic East. We woke up one day to find ourselves in a post situation. We woke up to a new reality of multiple dependencies and mental, if not economic and social subordination, invisibility to the wider world, and the continued forms of silencing, trivialization by the dominant discourses, the growing dispensability of our lives, the intricate colonization of being, of thinking, of perception, which continue today after political decolonization and after formal de-Sovietization as well. For various reasons and at various points, some of us refused to start from scratch and chose to start building our own models of re-existence, breaking out of the usual progressivist logic. The overnight dismantling of the socialist world in the early 1990s led to a very typical Western understanding of the post-Soviet exclusively as time in temporal terms and not as space, which followed the general logic of modernity, of course, with its habitual operation of translating geography into chronology and assigning whole groups of people living in the non-European, non-Western spaces to other times, or rather, let's say, positioning these people outside modernity, outside the only sanctioned course of time. At the same time, the validity of the concept post-socialist itself, of course, is being questioned more and more radically, together with the growing dispersal tendencies, relocating the former socialist subjects along different vectors and within different alliances in the new world order, where the socialist semi-periphery is sliding into peripheral condition. One of the leitmotifs of many discussions of the post-socialist condition and critique evolves around the progressivist idea of catching up with the West in epistemic terms, in technological terms, and in all other senses. This developmentalist derision needs to be questioned and deconstructed. The post-socialist discourse has never been legitimized other than in the area studies form in the West, and later also in the semi-periphery, supported by Western grants. The previous trajectories of knowledge were erased, and the scholars who wanted to join the global knowledge production were offered to start again from scratch, ignoring both the previous general socialist experience and knowledge as outdated and ideologically corrupt, and also ignoring their own local histories and genealogies of thought, or rather what was left of these genealogies as a result of the forced Soviet modernization. What was required from all of us fell into two familiar options that we all know: Orientalist annihilation or progressivist appropriation. The post-Soviet, with a few exceptions, became an equivalent of Amerindians, seen as a losing race bound to disappear or merge with the global South. The post-socialist Eastern European countries were interpreted in a more progressivist than Orientalist way, meaning that they were considered to be reformable and eventually subject to European assimilation, yet always with this preserved, unerasable sense of difference. The post-socialist other was offered to uncritically accept the existing hierarchy of the world, where everyone is assigned a precise, never questioned place, and even if we're unhappy with this place, with this frozen human taxonomy, which was naturalized by modernity, we are afraid of losing this quite precarious position and being associated with those who stand even lower, like the global South today. So, in 2 decades, all of this resulted in a peculiar post-colonial complex and even fashion within Europe, when the post-socialist people started to compare their situation or our situation with the former Third World and regard the core Europe as a stepmother. An important trigger for the post-socialist others to critically analyze parallels in their own experience and that of the post-colonial world was a realization of our common, newly global colonial status, which made the post-socialist world a twin of the post-colonial one. Not a twin within a separate empire, but within the world of the global coloniality. Well, for those who are not familiar with our decolonial language, global coloniality is different from colonialism. It defines the commonality of various post-dependence experiences. But how to understand the existing intersections between, for example, post-Soviet, post-dictatorship, post-apartheid, post-colonial, post-Fordist, these intersections stem from the very nature of modernity, yet they are not always unproblematically connected with its darker colonial side. So it's very important in this case not to withdraw into our local standpoint experience of oppression, but rather to create conditions for an multi-global vision and transversal coalitions of struggle against all modern colonial forms of dependence. The post-socialist world has had its own trajectory within the global coloniality. It was far from being monodirectional or sustained, as the former socialist countries, as you know, have been sent through a test of disappearance, erasing, dispersal, and a peculiar coming back, but coming back in a retrograde pattern, which made us outcasts both for the global North, the winner, and for the global South, large leftist parts of which were disappointed with the failed socialist modernity. This unfortunate logic is clear in many spheres, including feminism, and wider the production of knowledge from which the post-socialist subject was effectively expelled. This trajectory was the opposite of the usual logic of the non-Western world, slowly entering the space of rationality. In the post-Soviet case, the shift is the reverse, from the Second World to the global South, or to a strange limbo of the poor North, which refuses to be equalized with the poor South, and which, in addition to that, has its own South and East of the poor North, the post-Soviet, post-colonial spaces. Different from Francis Fukuyama's infamous interpretation of the end of history was summarized by Boris Groys in his idea of the radical and apocalyptic culmination as a gist of the socialist project. The post-communist subject travels the same route as described by the dominating discourse of cultural studies, he says, but he or she travels this route in the opposite direction, not from the past to the future, but from the future to the past, from the end of history back to historical time. Post-communist life is life lived backwards, a movement against the flow of time. So what Groys, I think, wants to stress is that the communist modernity went against the course of the world history, in a sense transcended it. When the project failed, we were all forced to come back to the usual established course, speed, and most importantly, direction of history, and to the camouflaged but recognizable mild progressivism as opposed to radical socialist one. And this was interpreted by many people as way backwards. This was particularly true of the socialist women, who were among the first to experience the painful pullbacks from the dubious socialist gender system to the miseries of cruel neoliberalism combined with neo-traditionalist revivals, often erasing even the smallest and most meager advantages of the socialist times. Thus, Liliana Burkar, this is a feminist from former Yugoslavia, claims that the so-called transition from socialism to capitalism is a euphemism for aggression. It stands for the massive scaling back of essential socioeconomic rights, which affects women differently from men. The reinstallment of capitalist social relations rests on the processes of repatriarchalization, most clearly evident in the dismantling of the socialist welfare system. So what happened that we were offered to forget about our version of modernity with its own gender system and start from scratch in a paradigm of someone else's modernity, in this case Western and neoliberal. When I say our own, I don't mean that we all share the ideals of socialist modernity, of course, that we were its creators. No, on the contrary, the majority of the people who found themselves under the Soviet rule were its victims who had to build themselves into the Soviet modernity to survive. But this cruel and in many cases colonial form of enforced socialism lasted for several decades, leaving its marks, its traces on us, the collective memories that some people are nostalgic about and others condemn. But no matter how we interpret this shared past, we will probably won't be able or willing to forget it and erase this experience, pretending to be or acting as subalterns who are only starting to learn to speak. Many post-socialist countries, including the non-European ones, prior to the Bolsheviks coming to power, had their own local women's movements, unions, journals, and other such organizations, at least for several decades. These gender initiatives, as a rule, were linked with the shaping of the ideals of the new woman, which was regarded as a very important part of the national liberation movements and the evolvement of national identities and national consciousness. It's true, of course, that women were often instrumentalized within these movements and discourses, and early on there emerged certain tensions between the feminist agendas and the nationalist discourses. But what is important here is that by the time the Soviet Union occupied or reoccupied its national peripheries, the local national feminist movements already existed for quite some time, and the Bolsheviks had to erase these previous traditions to impose their versions of modernity, just like it's happening now when the neoliberal modernity is being imposed onto the ex-Second World. Moreover, we are not speaking here of some indigenous authentic gender systems, of course, that were destroyed by the Soviets. We are speaking rather of a more complex situation in which any indigenous gender models were already contaminated by the struggles and dialogues with modernity in its various more or less authentic forms. For example, the influence of Germany or Sweden in this region, and difficult relations with Russian Tsarist Empire, of course. An important trigger here was the fact that most of these future socialist countries were, in this or that way, the colonial territories of various, mostly second-rate empires, such as the Ottoman Sultanate or Russian Empire or Habsburg Empire. The panorama of the pre-Soviet feminist movements included several Baltic women's movements, the emerging feminisms in the Slavic polities and provinces in Ukraine, for example, in Belarus, the Jadid Muslim reformers movements, many of whom focused on women's rights, education, healthcare, and reproduction rights. But all of these phenomena were destroyed and interrupted with the coming of the violent state socialist modernity. Often the Bolsheviks manipulatively used the local initiatives and movements to gain power in the regions, subsequently destroying these movements and their leaders under the tag of bourgeois nationalists. Once again, this tactic was widely used in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, in Eastern Europe. The local feminist initiatives were dangerous and uncontrollable, often linked with undesirable national identity rhetoric, and were subject to destruction by the Soviet regime, which very quickly replaced these banned local initiatives with the center-controlled missionaries of women councils, as you see here in this picture, educating the local women into the ideal of the new socialist working mother, In the non-European spaces, this was practically identical with the civilizing colonialist discourses, when the local women indeed acquired a number of rights thanks to Sovietization. But of course today the situation is different, but I won't go into this now. The situation was indeed different for Central and Eastern European countries, where it was insane to even attempt to impose the civilizing discourses from the Russian Soviet side. For example, the Baltic countries had a higher educational level. In Czarist times, Estonia and Finland were the two provinces with the highest literacy, whereas Russia proper was practically illiterate. So here there were several decades of independent statehood experience also, and their own constitutions, which in many cases guaranteed a number of women's rights and equality. So in this case, the Soviet version was clearly and obviously a recoil, which luckily for these countries didn't last long, although was extremely cruel and bloody, as we know. It's crucial to remember these asymmetries in our critical reflection on the common shared post-socialist experience. After the collapse of the USSR, many grants, many educational and research programs were redistributed and refurbished along different geopolitical divisions that were more fitting for the new situation, and this redivision of the academic labor immediately affected women's studies and more or less institutionalized forms of feminism. The absolute authority of the West as the sole producer of knowledge was reinstated once again, together with its modern colonial division of the academic labor, making the local discourses, including feminism, to desire to be allowed into the elite club of those who produce theory with a capital letter, and therefore to reproduce this catching up logic once again. This effect was particularly devastating for the emergent women's studies, which were entirely imported from the West, together with the discourses of development, again, transition economies, democratization, human rights, and the mantra of the free market. This logic repeated, again, the civilizing discourse, which is built into modernity rhetoric, but with an important deviation. Instead of the downtrodden colonial women, there were the post-socialist women, in this case, who sometimes were also post-colonial, as in the non-European republics of the USSR. The specific Soviet experience of another emancipation and the efforts to create its own new woman version in her metropolitan and colonial variants, grounded in Soviet, typically Soviet double standards, placed the gendered subjects of the ex-colonies into conditions, very, very vague conditions. They are not quite post-colonial and not entirely post-socialist. They cannot be taken to race, ethnicity, or religion, but they shouldn't and cannot be taken to ideology or class. Yet, in continuing context of the epistemic power asymmetries, the nuances, these nuances of the Soviet gender trajectories, to say nothing of the pre-socialist local genealogies of women resistance or queer resistance, tend to be erased, of course. Yet the absence of feminism in the official socialist discourse doesn't mean, of course, that it didn't exist in reality, or that socialist women in all their diversity did not have their own experience of struggle, compromises, painful efforts to construct their own selves in spite of official hypocrisy and double standards. This experience, once again, cannot be reduced to ideology, the same way as it cannot be reduced to colonialism. It existed at the intersection of these discourses, leading to a creation of a model which, after the collapse of socialism, turned out to be colonial as a whole. A number of Eastern European socialist countries, as we know, were quite successful and consistent in empowering their women, and also various forms of feminism continued to exist in the midst of the socialist patriarchy, or were revived as an important protest movement instrumental in overthrowing the repressive regimes. Many of such underground feminist movements in Eastern Europe existed in between art and political activism. It's worth mentioning that such underground feminist groups in the Eastern Europe and in the USSR soon discovered the sexist nature of some dissident discourses within which they attempted to situate themselves at first. Subsequently, these feminists delinked from dissident movements, and by the 1980s, many of them immigrated to the West. For example, here you see Rada Vekovic, a Croatian feminist who immigrated and has been living in Paris for the last 30 years, I think, and 25 years. But what is important is that already 40 years ago, the first wave of then still technically socialist feminists realized these discrepancies, temporal inconsistencies, and paradoxes, or backwards movements that existed between their own experience and that of Western feminism. So here you see a quotation from Rada that I'm not going to read out, but she writes about her own experience and how she discovered that there were parallels, but there were also opacities between the socialist feminism and the Western one. At the same time, state socialism, of course, in neither of its forms was ever able to adequately resolve the women's or much less sexuality question. The Bolsheviks soon proclaimed that the equality of the sexes has been attained, subsequently stigmatized feminism as a bourgeois movement, quickly got rid of all its activists, shut down the women's councils everywhere except the so-called national peripheries, which was a clear case of socialist orientalism, of course. This logic is still there, is revived today in the attitudes of Russian feminists to their non-Russian colleagues in the former non-European republics of the USSR. The situation was far from ideal also for the Russian women, for presumably fully emancipated women of the metropolis. Their advancement and gaining an awareness of their rights was increasingly dangerous for men in power, and so these privileged women were given token symbolic recognition to avoid any serious resistance on their part. Hence, we have the infamous Stalin's rollback to traditionalism in the form of such laws as the abortion ban, the complicated divorce procedures, illegitimate children and single mothers, deprivation of rights, recriminalization of homosexuality. All of this meant to impose a rigid Soviet biopolitics and the control of the population's sexuality, reproduction, corporality, through a very conservative version of the Soviet coloniality of gender. In many socialist countries, this logic was similar, though the timing could be different. But as you see here, it's Renata Zhambreshi-Skirin's words. She says that there were two collective projects, the patriarchal project and the communist project, and they collaborated in trying to impose their power on these women and exploited women's labor and reproductive power, as she says. The reanimated patriarchy of the 1970s and especially 1980s in the second world, in the socialist world, had an economic explanation as well, particularly in the Soviet Union, because at that point there was this shrinking labor markets which couldn't provide women anymore with even token equal opportunities and chose to sacrifice women and push them back to unpaid work and in the future smaller pensions. Women developed certain resistance strategies and ways to go around the system, which I called in my book gender tricksterism, which is an important part of the socialist feminist movements. In today, often this part is erased, it's neglected, whereas the actual women's conditions of the post-Soviet society, as well as a number of post-socialist states, is characterized by renewed exploitation, turning women once again into a highly precarious group and presented under a guise of patriarchal traditionalism and going back to the roots and national or religious values. For example, in Russia, it's always religious values. This return of this housewifeization on the surface is often presented as a benefit for women, such as precarious part-time and home-based jobs, for instance. With the complete collapse of the welfare system, the post-Soviet women are either forced into socialist scorn childlessness or to housewifeization and a complete biopolitical control. Thus, in Russia, women are interesting for the collapsing state and economy only in the capacity of producers of soldiers and cheap labor whose own unpaid work is not considered worth the state's or society's acknowledgement. In some cases, the conservative nationalist anti-socialist forces even equate women with communists, dismissing them on the grounds that women were responsible for communism in the first place because women were granted rights. And here you see Svetlana Slapchak, who stresses this carefully cultivated wisdom of the colonized as an effective tool restoring conservative values imposed as liberation from socialist ideological constraints. So this going back or reliving modernization and emancipation for the second time, and in many cases even third time or fourth time, under the motto of the finally correct neoliberal modernity, has marked the experience of various post-socialist women's movements and feminist organizations. The post-socialist subjects were offered and willingly accepted a generalized, sanitized Western vantage point to look at our own past, and were allowed to criticize it only from someone else's prepackaged perspective. For a while, what happened was that the post-socialist feminists continued to reproduce this catching-up paradigm, never exercising our right to assess our own complex historical experiences and make sense of them from our own geopolitics and body politics of knowledge, of perception, of being, of gender. With very few exceptions, mostly in Eastern Europe and in China, the post-socialist feminist works tended to be theoretically heavily dependent on Western theory, descriptive, and often reduced to this kind of native informants sort of research, applying the Western theory to local material. These important fieldwork studies were often appropriated also by a number of Western colleagues enjoying their monopoly on knowledge production to make often questionable generalizations, while the voices of the post-socialist feminists were once again not heard. They were muted. Feminists from a number of post-socialist countries state that the geopolitics of knowledge always situates the feminist approach to reality. And this has given rise to, as they say, the three main questions that the post-socialist feminisms rise. The role of the post-East feminisms, the issue of the mechanisms of neocolonization in post-socialist reality, and how to relate to them also, of course, and finally, the relation of the feminism and the left. And these questions can still be used, I think, as a basis for our reflections on what we share after 25 years, and if we share anything at all as post-socialist feminists. For one thing, I believe that an important step in this process would be questioning the darker side of the Soviet and socialist modernity, helping to formulate a post-socialist complex critique and a positive program also for the future, which wouldn't be restricted by either post-Fordist or post-socialist, post-modernist or post-colonial lens, instead of that attempting to draw a dynamic intersectional picture and an open dialogic attitude to others, and particularly the others from the global south, with whom we do share a lot, yet still are not able to find a good suitable language to communicate. This is possible only through a conscious getting rid of this kind of condescending residual separation of the post-socialist self from the problems of the global south, and getting rid of this maternalistic attitudes of many post-socialist feminists to the women of the global south, and also to our own local women who are not feminists. It's also important for the post-socialist feminists to attempt changing the optics, I think, and looking at the social reality through a wider than gender lens. Here we could productively appropriate the views of Argentine-American feminist philosopher Maria Lugones, taking gender into account in understanding of resistance and its sources, for example, resistance to neoliberal globalization, instead of reading gender into the texture that shapes the self, in its relation to opposition. Then a different logic which organizes a social in resistance would open. So if we refuse to mechanically read gender into the social, we would be able to see the organization of the social in terms demonstrating a deep conceptual incongruence in the process of imposing gender constructs onto ourselves. We need a wider and more complex intersectional approach, getting rid of disciplinarian nationalism and gatekeeping. The common denominator in many post-dependence cases, including our case, the post-socialist case, will be getting rid of this trauma. It's not necessarily colonial trauma. It can be a trauma of imperial difference, typical for Russian sensibility. It can be an experience of a second-rate European from Eastern Europe who for centuries have been multiply dependent on various empires. After a careful deconstruction of this exclusion experience, it is regenerated and reworked then into an other view, often grounded in re-existence. And what is re-existence? It's a term which was offered by Colombian artist and thinker Adolfo Albana Quinte. It's a step from a negative resistance, an often violent model, to a creation of an alternative reality positive model, reformatting the world or sometimes contemplating the reasons for our inability to do so. So re-existence is positive in contrast with resistance, but it's also utopian, of course. It's a fiction which, in Jacques Ranciere's formulation, challenges the existing distribution of the real and the fictional. And this is probably its main political function. One of the important transversal concepts that is useful in our efforts to conceptualize post-socialist feminisms is the concept of border thinking and border existence. And I would say just a few words about that. It was made famous, as you know, by Chicano theorists Moraga and Ansaldúa in 1981. in their critical border thinking as a constant negotiation and neither nor-ness, as a product of a complex and dynamic interaction with modernity. It corresponds to the philosophic concept of exteriority, the outside that was invented and created from the inside. And this is the way exteriority is understood by Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel, from the totality of the dominant discourse, as he says. When he says that, he wants to stress that there is no exteriority. It's all constructed, it's created. It's not in ontology, it's in epistemology. Such an exteriority, grounded in the experience of being born and educated in the entanglement of the Western invention of modernity, does not call for going back to some archaic primordial state. Rather, it draws the attention to how and what form modernity actually invented the negative image of tradition, including its gendered and racialized versions. The exteriority of living and thinking in hostile environments, and yet reinstating one's epistemic rights, leads to an itinerant, forever open, multiple positionality marked by transformationism, shifting identifications, and the rejection of this either-or binarity, turning instead to a non-exclusive duality and unsublated contradictions. Taking a border position means negotiating between modernity and its others, between the frozen categorical thinking and the fusion of intermeshing realities. This allows decentralized dynamic groups to understand each other in mutual struggles. And there are a lot of examples for that, of course. Cella Sandoval's famous methodology of the oppressed, Maria Lugones' principle of non-aggressive loving perception, which she formulated in one of her early articles back in the 90s, and Tri Minh Ha's idea of critical difference from and infinite layers of oneself. These are all important elements of such border thinking and praxis. Border thinking and relational oppositional praxis are very effective transformative tools, potentially leading to the emergence of flexible, non-ossified, and open coalitions of resistance. Such a praxis is grounded in a nomadic traveling mode of existence, which sees culture itself as a journey, as a process of social construction, and also aims at constructing a new subject of a new feminist geopolitics of knowing and loving. And here it's interesting that Eastern and Central Europe, as well as the Caucasus and Central Asia, belong to regions that have been for centuries paradigmatic border zones, negotiating various imperial influences, carving a space for their own multiple identifications. Here people are used to borders cutting inside ourselves, and also to various regional communities of sense, often very changeable, very volatile, and they're still no less but more important than, for example, much later constructed nation states, where they're often artificial identities. This specific sensitivity makes it easier to attune to various voices and positions, and to work for establishing coalitions in often opposite directions, to find intersecting perspectives with both the North and the South, without entirely belonging to either of them. But any of such coalitions, of course, can emerge only through critical and dynamic intersectionality, problematizing of different ways and modes of discrimination, and also regarding them as a dynamic mode instead of clinging to these fixed monocategorical methods. We all remember, of course, that the original three categories involved in intersectionality were race, gender, and class. But today it's not enough, because we speak, theories speak also about sexuality, age, disability, nationality, language, religion, what have you, and include them in intersectional analysis. But intersectionality understood as merely this ascertaining of multiplicity and complexity is not enough. And here I would like to draw your attention to Nina Lucas' understanding of intersectionality. She says that it must be maximally open, unfinished, and inclusive. She likens her theorizing of intersectionality to situated nodal points rather than a fixed system that is shifting space for overlapping and contradictory interactions of gender, class, nation, sexuality, and language. But for me, as a decolonial thinker, also a more subtle problem with intersectionality is the question of enunciation. To use semiotic terms, the spatial and temporal context of communication, the conditions in which the discourse is produced, including the answer to the question of who produces this discourse, why, and in whose interests, who speaks in and of intersectionality, and from what position this enunciation is made. The more important it becomes to focus on different tangential genealogies of being, knowledge, gender, perception, and to shift the emphasis from the enunciated to the enunciation. Here we could quote Walter Mignolo, of course, who famously describes it as I am where I think, thus rethinking the Cartesian formula. What is meant here is the geopolitics of knowledge, the body politics of knowledge, being, perception, and thinking, that are linked with agents, experiences, and memories, which were denied the right to act as full subjects. The accent then should be not on the description of reality, but on the elaboration of concepts which would affirm their own locus of enunciation, arguing from a specific position formulated thanks to the phenomenon described, but based on epistemic disobedience and delinking. In the post-socialist space, with its silences and omissions, unspoken resentments and continued scorn between, for example, Russian and non-Russian, secondary European and non-European gendered subjects, the colonized minds and bodies are marked by one urge to become a peripheral part of someone else's modernity, belatedly repeating and reproducing the Western agendas and discourses. Intersectionality then is too early to be regarded as a merely reconciling device in this case, even to a larger extent than it happens, for example, in the US or in Western Europe, where also migrants reclaim intersectionality as a weapon and a way of identifying the ongoing conflict with the mainstream white feminism. Today, when Russia has turned into a fundamentalist police state, any feminism is suspicious to power. Practically all post-Soviet feminist movements and organizations are now either banned or harassed as foreign agents. These conditions further postpone the possibilities of any intersectional alliances. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, the Soviet modernity is replaced with either the vaguely westernized model of peddling nationalist and fundamentalist discourses once again. The old progressivist scheme of the ex-colonial, post-Soviet gendered other still exists. It sees women as forever climbing the stairs of modernity, from traditionalism through Soviet half-traditional, half-modern model and to the Western liberated female. In contrast with Chinese gender theorists who claim the refusal to walk the path of universal feminism, wearing Western shoes uncomfortable for their feet because they already walked a long way along their own path, gender discourses in Eurasia and peripheral Eurasia seldom break the spell of modernity. The more important it becomes today for the post-socialist gendered others to get acquainted with alternative approaches to gender, to finally be indoctrinated from the theorists and activists of the global south, and also make our ideas available to them. To do this, we need to delink from neoliberal modernity epistemologically, institutionally, and administratively, working for a creation of bypassing volatile networks, events, flexible projects, disobeying the mainstream academic institutional control. Among the reasons for the lack of the South-to-South and semi-periphery-to-periphery coalitions, the most important ones are, of course, ignorance, lack of information, intensified by continuing intellectual coloniality, a persistent agonistic model, and an unwillingness to drop one's status as a second world. Overcoming these difficulties requires goodwill from all of us, from all sides, actually, which is easier said than done. Real ways out of these internal and external epistemic asymmetries are not in recognition claims, I think, but rather in delinking from the losing battle and from the logic of catching up and dependency discourses in the sphere of knowledge production, and concentrating on creating a discourse and a praxis which would be well aware of other models, including the Western, the latest Western and non-Western ones, but would not simply repeat them or mechanically apply them to a different material. Finding intersections in our experience and sensibilities, we can try to recreate a flexible discourse on sexuality, various gender models, and maybe even other than gender resistances, which would answer the local logic and specific conditions, yet would be able to correlate with other voices in the world. To do this, we necessarily take a broad and intersectional pluritopic position, negotiating between modernity in various forms and its internal and external others, instead of endlessly ascertaining one's multiple oppressions and replaying these inferiority complexes. Such a positive and at the same time critical intersectionality would develop in the direction of an open, liberating, and creolized theorizing. Transversal crossings of activism and theorizing are often grounded in what an Armenian queering collective, it's called Queer in Yerevan, called slant activism. That is an indirect, ironic, complex resistance to the state and other forms of power, particularly in its biopolitical forms, are among the most effective tools today, I think, in social and political struggles against multiple oppressions and for this creation of another world where many different worlds coexist in a correlational way, communicate with each other in a positive and life-asserting model, and aim at restoring human dignity and the right to be different but equal. It's necessary to further elaborate an open, critical, loosely methodological basis which would take into account the existing parallels between various echoing concepts, echoing and epistemic grounds of feminist discourses, and would find an or better yet, transdisciplinary language for expressing the oppositional being, thinking, agency across transcultural and transepistemic pluriversal spaces. My talk necessarily has an open ending, of course, as the post-socialist condition and people are in a state of flux, though there is still a fragile and emergent post-socialist community of sense holding us together. Our dependencies continue in new forms of global coloniality, pushing the socialist experience farther and farther away, and sometimes placing it into a museum shelf. And yet, as long as we refuse to critically reflect on this past, continue to vegetate amongst our complexes and suppressed desires, nostalgia and hatred, there will be no path to any future. We must therefore learn to see the post-socialist condition not as a nostalgic going back tool, lamenting over the lost past or condemning it, but rather as a difficult way to this future existence. The post-history existence is yet, of course, a utopian model, but it's important for the post-socialist women to reflect on our mutual experience and work out together this flexible, open, intersectional, and dialogical theory and praxis, a collective cathartic therapy which hopefully will help us better understand ourselves and our place in the world, and never slide back into this vicious circle of forever dependent existence. Thank you.
Many thanks to Madina for this thought-provoking and very complex paper. And before I open the floor for questions, I just want to point out that I personally think that the way in which you draw attention to the plurality and asymmetries between the experiences of different post-socialist subjects is important for our context. And that's something that I think all of us should kind of try to think through a little bit more, because somehow the post-socialist experience tends to be lumped together, like kind of as Eastern European as post-socialist, and it's not often quite sort of specified
what is meant
and
exactly.
What is meant by this. So,
right.
So I very much appreciated the way in which you try to kind of draw out like this different specificities and make us think about the also. In addition to the commonalities that we still share, also these asymmetries and discrepancies between experiences. And I think maybe the one crucial question I would take from this is what you said towards the middle part of your paper, that what do we still share, and if we share anything at all after 25 years as post-socialist subjects? I mean, when do we cease to be post-socialists? Or are we forever in this kind of state of transition?
I think you're forever there, yeah, but then you choose a different trajectory, and that's what most people did, right? Because today it is fragile, yeah? Because what determines it? Language? No, not anymore, right? Some of these countries look more to the west, others more to the east, right? So it's very hard. I mean, geopolitically, there is no concept of post-socialism anymore, I don't think so. Even if Russia is trying to do something about it, but I think it's doomed. But I mean, yeah, and at the same time, I think it is important to reflect on that critically. You cannot just erase it. You cannot put it in your unconscious, because then it's going to bug you all the time.
But would you still argue for the need to kind of articulate a post-socialist feminist
I don't know.
perspective on its own right? Is there a need for that?
I don't know. Well, I'm suspicious generally of all these efforts to establish studies. You know, when people say, okay, let's call it studies, like intersectionality studies or whatever, because then it's the end of it. It's dead, right?
With the institutionalization of these critical questions.
So that's why I think, for example, when we'll be making this book, we have to kind of make it, you know, to delink from all of this area studies approaches, and generally studies, because studies is always based on subject-object division.
Right.
And we don't want that. But it's very hard to write in that way, because academic discourse requires you to write in that way.
Right.
Otherwise you don't look scientific enough, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard, it's tough, really. But I don't think we need to establish more studies.
So what are we to do?
We have to think about a name. Well, I don't know, reflection, thinking, whatever. But not studies, no.
Not studies. Okay, we refrain from that. Okay, I would like to very much hear questions from the audience.
My name is Ege Kulbok. I'm just finalized my PhD thesis about cultural policy, and I would like to thank you very much, because you just said very clearly out what I intended and what I feel, that we can't go on until we are able to reflect critically on this socialist project and socialist modernity with all these circumstances. And I agree totally. And what I wanted to ask is a bit, it is very huge discussion what comes into my mind, and I'm not able to ask about all. But the moment I would like to ask about what do you mean with neoliberal modernity? Aren't we on the post modernity already? Or how you conceptualize this all varieties of modernities, Western, Eastern, and failed modernities, very similar as I conceptualized it, and I totally agree with that. But what do you mean with neoliberal modernity? Maybe it is post-modernity, or
okay.
Just.
Shall we collect questions, or do I answer immediately?
As you wish.
Well,
I think
time-wise.
Just
okay,
take
I
it.
answer. Yeah, you're right. It's a huge question that we could be discussing until tomorrow morning at least. But when I say modernity, of course, I'm speaking as a decolonial scholar, let's say, right? Because in the decolonial option, modernity means all of that you mentioned. It includes post-modernity, alter-modernity, all other versions, yes, because we're speaking about certain elements of modernity that are there no matter in what stage it is now. And actually, I'm working now on a chapter for a new book where I try to explain, for example, why when Nicolas Bourriaud comes with the term alter-modern in one of his recent exhibitions, he's still speaking about modernity, even if you call it alter, but when you look what it consists of, there's still the same kind of progressivism, the same kind of, trying to impose forcefully certain ideals and make people happy by force, let's say, right? Which is, I think, inside modernity is built in one of the elements. Yeah, but it's a big discussion. So for me, yes, it's there are some differences between the first modernity and second modernity, circular modernity from the 18th century on. Then you have post-modernity, which questions some of these notions, but it still does it from inside modernity itself. If you look at any of Foucault, I don't know, any of famous postmodernists, they cannot help being, speaking from inside the Western modernity. So yes, they do question a lot of things and they deconstruct a lot of things, but there are limitations precisely connected with this. And they cannot possibly be in the position of exteriority that I was talking about, this border lands, right, and a border thinking and border existence. When, as Anzaldúa says, the border cuts inside you. It's not that you cross borders, but the border is inside your body and your soul or whatever, and so you have to live always with this condition of being divided. And this is something that I think is not typical for even for postmodernism or anti-modernism. Okay.
Another question in front here.
Thank you very much, Madina. My name is Liina Siib, and I am artist. And sorry for my not so theoretical question, but what intrigues me is a concept of solidarity. And I don't even know if this is the right place to put it on, but how do we tackle in this new situation of neoliberalist time, in our post-socialist situation, with the terms and concepts from Soviet time, like solidarity, whatever it means, whatever it meant then, and does it mean anything for us nowadays when we are living in this precarious, very competitive situation? Also, all the women are fighting with each other for a job. Sorry to say so, but this is it. This is how it is. So we all try to find our ends to meet. So what to do with this old and new concepts and words?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much also for this wonderful question. This is also something that bugs me. Well, I wouldn't use the word solidarity, but I like the concept itself. I mean, we could call it coalitions or whatever, alliances, right? Just maybe to avoid this kind of socialist jargon, because sometimes people are scared with that when they hear this, right? And this is another problem, because we had this real experience of state socialism, and that's why post-socialist women are usually skeptical to a lot of socialist ideals, let's say, that might still be important for the people who are radically left in the West, for instance, right? Because we really know what it comes to when, yeah, so we are more skeptical and more kind of, I don't know, cynical sometimes as well, because we have more experience with that. But I don't think that it means that we have to get rid of solidarity. We have to find other new ways to build these coalitions. And I think that a lot of it, for example, for me, is connected with the way different people in the world, different groups of women, for instance, in the world, they deal with modernity / coloniality, how it affects them. It can be in the form of what you said, these agonistics, as I would say, right? That people are always competing with each other for jobs or whatever, right? For social lives, for social status. So what we usually talk about in decolonial feminism is like, don't compete, delink from this, you know? Just step aside, okay? Let other people compete, because they have been built into this competing system that makes a mechanism, a machine out of you. And so the most important thing is here how to build coalitions around this kind of traps that modernity, post-modernity, alter-modernity has for us. And it's very difficult because you need money, you need to survive, yeah? It's very difficult to kind of stay within some kind of institutions and at the same time not lose your ability to fight and to, you know, to be radical and to oppose. But that's not only a problem of post-socialist feminism, it's generally a problem of any feminism, I think, that as soon as you are institutionalized in any way, you become entrapped. But I don't believe in institutions in this old modern way. I think these institutions should be rather events, and they should be volatile, they should be maybe created for an hour or for a day or I don't know, for a certain purpose, and then people disperse, but it doesn't mean that they disperse to become these kind of lonely individuals. They still have connections, but these connections are extremely open. You know, and as you see here, for example, people congregate and there are certain ideas and certain leitmotifs that keep us all together. One of them can be our post-socialist condition. Another one may be, in your case, Estonian feminism and its trajectories and genealogies. And in different situations, you may have a different volatile institution and coalitions and you know, solidarities with people of the global south, for instance, or with just feminists even from the West, and well, why not, who are, for example, against the cruel forms of neoliberalism. And so there are different kind of threads that can hold these institutions together, but they have to be very, very open, not like the old political parties, you know, that don't fit the reality of 21st century, for instance. It has to be very open and very kind of, I don't know, liquid, I would say. Okay.
Yes, more questions?
My name is Martin Aidnik and I'm a PhD student at Tallinn University. Thank you for your presentation. You spoke in length about the predicament of Eastern Europe And I think one of the major ills in contemporary Eastern Europe is nationalism, which was in a way contained by the Soviet Union, but which has regained its predominance in many Eastern European countries. So I was wondering, what is your view on the relation between modernity and nationalism, and is there a way beyond nationalism in Eastern Europe? Thank you.
I like your questions. Very fundamental. We can go forever discussing modernity and nationalism. It's a very tough question, of course, because you, on the one hand, of course, as modern people would say, no, we don't like nationalism because it's exclusionary by nature, right? Of course, I don't. I don't like nationalism, probably because I have no nationality, right? I had a misfortune of being born in Russia, but I have no connections with it whatsoever. And I don't understand ethnic nationalism because I have too many ethnicities mixed in me. And so for me, it's an abstract thing. But on the other hand, you cannot be so blunt when you assess it, because you know that there is an element of anti-colonial movement in nationalist movements in Eastern Europe. And so you cannot just dismiss it, because there is always this element of national liberation and building a national identity and always being between different powers and trying to find carve a space, let's say, for yourself. And so, I think I'm divided in this case on how to treat nationalism. But I think there are a lot of good political science books written on that. For example, there is this guy, Partha Chatterjee. He's an Indian political scientist, and he wrote 3 or 4 really good books trying to see this difference and to investigate what happened in India after it got independence, and trying to see how anti-colonial nationalism starts as a very positive thing, and then it turns into a very negative and kind of frozen thing that is, very hostile to many groups of people. And so he tries to do that. And so if you're interested in that, I would advise you to read Partha Chatterjee's book, where he writes that. But of course, India is not Estonia or a Czech Republic, and so there are also differences connected with this local context and local histories. And I think part of it is that if in Partha Chatterjee's case, in case of India, it's clearly Orientalism and racism that is at work there. In Eastern Europe, it's completely different, because there is no complex concept of race in this usual understanding here. And the differences are more nuanced. And there can be racism, but it's a very strange kind of racism that is connected not with the color of skin, but with other things, when it's religion or language or whatever can be transferred and interpreted, racialized, let's say. And so we have to take this into account. But I think that for most of such nations, it's normal to go through a certain period of nationalism, although it's very painful, of course. And then the question is, do we really want again to kind of form in all these post-socialist Eastern European, for example, or whatever countries, this generally accepted idea of the civil nation, civic nation, when people are treated not as not by their blood, let's say, but their citizenship. In Russia, it has been totally a failure. They were trying to do something like that back in the Yeltsin years, but it never worked. And now we have really a fascist state, in a sense. Soon they will be building reservations, I think, for people. So this is a very tricky thing. On the one hand, yes, as you were saying, like you go into liberal and neoliberal discourse because sometimes you need to defend your position against extreme forms of nationalism, for example. But then it's tricky because you think, do all nations or nation states really need this kind of idea of citizen, which is denationalized, de-ethnicized? Is it possible to build it? Or maybe there should be other forms that are in the making, or they existed, but then they were forgotten. And that's why I'm more and more interested in this kind of coalitions again, that are other than nation states, because there are regional coalitions that are becoming more and more important. For instance, in the Caucasus, that is always in the state of war, has been in the state of war for several centuries, and And it's interesting that people can belong to different ethnicities, different languages, different religions even. Some of them Muslim, others Christian. But there is still this pan-Caucasian community of sense, and people understand each other better than they would understand Russians, for instance, or whoever, right? And so I think that this also has to be taken into account in questions of nationalism, because this regional identity is more complex, and it can, in some cases, transcend this narrow ethnic nationalism, because then it presupposes that there are people of different ethnicities coexisting, cohabiting for many, decades, centuries, and they have been finding ways how to communicate with each other in a peaceful way and create some kind of community. And I think this is what is going to slowly happen if politicians don't interfere too much, of course, into that. Okay.
Are you sure? You don't want? Maybe we can take the last burning question.
Okay.
My question is to do with language.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that in order to have a dialogue with another woman from a post-socialist country, or a woman from China, or a woman from India, we end up using English as the linking language. And we end up having a discussion on the pages of an international women's studies journal where we feel compelled to cite Western feminists. Is there any way of having a dialogue across language borders without stepping into this potentially imperialist trap of once again quoting Western feminists and never getting to what we really want to talk about?
Oh, okay. No, I think it's possible to kind of play with that, because maybe because I've been studying post-colonial literature for a long time, and I'm used to the strategies that post-colonial writers use. They can write it in English, but in such a way that an Englishman won't understand anything in that novel, or in French, but in such a way that a French person from Paris won't understand it, but an Arabic person would, living in Morocco, for instance, right? And so I think you can do the same with English. You can remake it, you can, reuse it, you can make up words. Yeah, why not? Language is for that. And by the way, that's why the most interesting writers now, I think, that are the ones that write not in the native language, because they have a better feeling. They can detach themselves from the language. They use it consciously, and then they play with it, like Vladimir Nabokov did, for instance, writing in English. Yeah, it's a problem. But then I think we have to work with it strategically. If we want coalitions, then at this point we need to use English, because it will make it possible for everybody to understand. Once I was at a conference in South Africa, and there was this conference of International Organization of Comparative Literature, something. Of course, the working language was English. And there was a separate kind of workshop for local writers. And one of the writers was very radical, very kind of Afrikaner writer. He said, I will be speaking in Gikuyu, in my native language. And nobody understood him in the audience, or maybe 3 people did. And so finally he said, point taken. And even if he was very anti-colonial and all that, and he didn't like the idea that all these people from the Western Europe came to Pretoria and were sitting there and discussing their stuff, and nobody was listening to him. But he wanted us to understand him, and he wanted a coalition with those people in the audience who thought differently. And so I think, yes, we have to do this. I mean, we have to publish stuff in English, as you know, now, in order to get any kind of promotion at the university, right? And as Anibal Quijano told me once, he said that before I used to print my works in Spanish, but now they were published in English. So the difference is there, yeah? If you print your stuff in Estonian or in Russian, it's non-existent for this global academic community. We do have to do that. But it's a question of what you write in English, yeah? What do you want to say? So it's fine, I think. Okay.
Okay, I'm really sorry we have to close the session because we're really over time.
I talk too much, sorry.
And I want to thank Madina once again for this very thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you. Thanks.